Introducing Noam Chomsky, a leading voice of dissent. Noam Chomsky is a well-known intellectual. He is famous for his sharp critiques of power. Chomsky is a linguist, philosopher, and political activist. He has written many books and articles. His work often challenges the status quo. Chomsky is considered one of the most influential thinkers of our time. Chomsky's work is rooted in the belief that power structures often act against the interests of ordinary people. He argues that governments, corporations, and media often work together. Their goal is to maintain control and further their own agendas. This can come at the expense of justice, equality, and human rights. Chomsky encourages critical thinking. He wants people to question what they are told. He believes that understanding how power operates is crucial. This knowledge can empower individuals to resist injustice and create a more equitable world. Chomsky's work continues to inspire activists, scholars, and citizens concerned about the state of global affairs. Hegemony or Survival: America's Defining Choice. Hegemony or Survival is a powerful book. It examines America's role in the world. Noam Chomsky argues that the United States pursues global dominance. He believes this pursuit threatens the survival of humanity. The book's title reflects this central argument. America faces a stark choice. It can either continue its quest for hegemony with potentially disastrous consequences, or choose the path of cooperation and survival. Chomsky argues that the United States employs a grand strategy. This strategy aims to maintain its position as the world's sole superpower. The US uses its military and economic might to achieve its goals. Chomsky provides historical examples to support his claim. He points to interventions in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. These actions, he argues, are driven by a desire for control rather than genuine concern for democracy or human rights. The book serves as a warning. Chomsky believes that America's pursuit of hegemony is unsustainable and dangerous. He calls for a radical shift in US foreign policy. Chomsky urges a move away from militarism and towards diplomacy, international cooperation, and respect for international law. Unveiling the mechanics of US foreign policy. Chomsky argues that US foreign policy is driven by a desire for power. He says that the US uses various tactics to achieve its goals. These include military intervention, economic sanctions, and covert operations. Chomsky believes that the US often justifies these actions with rhetoric of freedom and democracy. However, he argues that the real motive is to maintain its dominance over global resources and strategic interests. One of Chomsky's key arguments is that the US often supports undemocratic regimes. This happens when these regimes align with US interests. He points to historical examples like the US backing of dictatorships in Latin America and the Middle East. These actions, he argues, contradict the EU's stated commitment to democracy and human rights. Chomsky also criticizes the role of the media. He says that the media often fail to challenge the government's narrative on foreign policy. This lack of critical scrutiny, he argues, allows the US to pursue its hegemonic ambitions with little public opposition. History's echoes, lessons from the past. Chomsky believes that understanding history is crucial. He uses historical examples to support his arguments about US foreign policy. He argues that the US has a long history of intervening in other countries' affairs. These interventions are often justified as promoting democracy or fighting communism. However, Chomsky suggests that these actions often serve US economic and strategic interests. One example Chomsky uses is the Vietnam War. He argues that the US intervention in Vietnam was not about containing communism, as often claimed. Instead, he suggests that the US was more concerned with maintaining its influence in Southeast Asia. The war had devastating consequences for Vietnam and resulted in the loss of millions of lives. Chomsky also points to the US involvement in Latin America. He highlights numerous instances where the US supported coups and right-wing dictatorships. This support was often provided to protect US business interests or to counter leftist movements. These interventions, Chomsky argues, demonstrate a pattern of US interference in the region to maintain its dominance. Chomsky's analysis suggests that the US has consistently prioritized its own interests over the well-being of other nations and their people. His historical examples provide a sobering reminder of the human cost of US foreign policy. Case studies in hegemony, from Vietnam to Iraq. Chomsky doesn't just talk about the past, he also looks at current events. He uses the US invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq as examples. He says these wars are more about controlling resources and maintaining US dominance than spreading democracy. Chomsky is very critical of the war on terror. He says it's a way for the US to justify its actions around the world. He argues that the US often uses fear and propaganda to get public support for its military actions. He also talks about the US use of drones. Chomsky says that drone strikes often kill innocent civilians. He argues that these strikes create more enemies and make the world less safe. Chomsky's analysis of these events challenges the official narrative. He wants readers to think critically about US foreign policy and its consequences. Living in the shadow of American power. Chomsky's book looks at the effects of American power. He argues that the quest for hegemony has consequences. It leads to military interventions, economic exploitation, and environmental destruction. Chomsky believes that this quest for dominance ultimately harms everyone, including Americans. He argues that the huge US military budget takes money away from important things. These include education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Chomsky says that the focus on military spending creates a culture of fear. This fear then justifies more militarism and interventionism. Chomsky also talks about the impact of US foreign policy on democracy. He argues that the US often undermines democracy in other countries. It does this to protect its own interests. This undermines the very values the US claims to uphold. Chomsky's critique, a call to action or a cry in the wilderness. Chomsky's book Hegemony or Survival is a powerful critique of US foreign policy. It has been praised and criticized. Some people praise Chomsky for his courage and insight. They say his work is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand the world today. Others criticize Chomsky for being too critical of the US. They argue that he ignores the positive aspects of US foreign policy. Some critics also say that his solutions are unrealistic. Despite these criticisms, Chomsky's work remains influential. His book has sparked debate and encouraged people to think critically about the role of the US in the world.